Welcome back. I hope you were able to take full advantage of our speed networking function. Our next topic is supply chain resilience. The pandemic revealed many areas for improvement in supply chain resilience, further highlighted by global events and the economic uncertainty we're experiencing right now. We'll be looking at where the supply chain vulnerabilities are, how culture can affect a steady supply, the role of operations professionals within the NHS, now having visibility over widely fluctuating demand can meet problems head on, and how we can make sure the proactive response we make today avoid negatively impacting patient care tomorrow. So with me to discuss this important subject, I'm delighted to welcome Tracy Camish, Patient Safety and Clinical Intelligence, NHS Supply Chain, Tom Brailsford, Head of Supply Chain Resilience, NHS Supply Chain, and Catherine G, Head of Clinical Products Governance, Great Ormond Street, Hospital NHS Foundation Trust. Don't forget to join in with the conversation by using our Q&A function, which you'll find at the right-hand side of your screen. So welcome to all our guests for our second panel today. Lovely to see you all there. Catherine, we're going to start off with you, if that's okay. It's a question that I'm also like to hear from Tom and Tracy on. I just wondered if you could share examples of areas within the supply chain that were highlighted as vulnerable when we all went through the pandemic.
Hi, welcome. Sorry, thank you for having me this morning. There were many areas that were highlighted during the pandemic: critical medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, PPE, plus also staffing themselves. It's quite a broad topic, and obviously something that we hadn't planned on in the past, really. So it was something that everybody found very difficult. I believe that a lot of these issues were compounded by, but not limited to as well, topics that feed into this, such as single source suppliers, global dependencies, regulatory changes. As we know, the workforce and transport disruptions. There were many quality control issues, raw material shortages. We also had to contend with counterfeit products, or the potential for counterfeit products. We had to ensure our due diligence was undertaken. Plus, then we've also got to throw into the mix cybersecurity threats. There's a vast range of different elements that compounded those issues which we saw on the front line. So it's not really that there's one straightforward answer, unfortunately. In my opinion, it is quite a broad topic that needs a lot more input from many diverse different colleagues. Natural disasters as well, demand in surges. We weren't prepared for the demand in surges for many of the items that then we had issues with and experienced these vulnerabilities with. Does that answer your question somewhat, Helen?
Yeah, it does. And I'm just curious to know, Tracy, what was it like from your point of view? And, presumably, did you see some of those vulnerabilities during the pandemic, and perhaps, some more come to mind for you?
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, what we had during the pandemic was a melting pot of chaos that all seemed to hit at the same time. So we had the issue of Brexit right at the beginning of the year, and then we had this unprecedented, something that I've certainly never experienced in my 30 years. And from the frontline perspective, it's really about that, keeping people safe. And to Catherine's point, all of these multifaceted considerations we had to consider, to make sure that we were considering. We had to make sure very quickly that we were still keeping staff safe, and staff were having to adapt daily. And there's a huge human factor element that we have to be absolutely mindful of when it comes to product availability and usability of product to deliver care. So everything that Catherine has said, absolutely, it's so complicated, it's so complex, and we weren't the only one fishing in the pond for product. This was a global challenge. So we were all trying to do the best to make sure that the care that we were providing was maintained, but so was everyone else. So from a frontline perspective, we were all drafted in. We all had to do a bit, and I've never experienced anything like it, and I still think now staff are still feeling the impact of that time, and it's
Tom,
going to take quite a while to settle.
sorry to cut you off there, Tracy. Tom, it really was a challenge indeed, and one hopes that with big challenges like that come solutions, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what were the really key things that that you noticed and you found were our perhaps weaknesses during that time?
So for me, I think there's if you look at the vulnerability highlighted from a supply chain strategy perspective, you could perhaps point to the vulnerability of lean supply chain strategy overall, which is that you seek to eradicate waste at any turn, and supply chains across the world were hugely disrupted, and any vulnerability in any supply chain was instantly highlighted as a result of that pressure. And it wasn't just in healthcare; it was across multiple industries, automotive, microchips, consumer electronics. The huge. We all remember toilet paper being an issue. So we did see that lean supply chain design as a principle, which has been the push in supply chain management for 20 years plus, I would say. Just in time principles, the vulnerabilities of those strategies was certainly highlighted, and I think there has been something of a paradigm shift there, in the agility and flexibility are something that supply chain directors are far more willing to consider, and the cost base that kind of drives is seen as a reasonable trade-off across many sectors now, as the cost of kind of the ability to deliver strong service. We still see the fallout from the COVID pandemic across global supply chains, and it's about using those more agile and flexible principles appropriately in the right areas to withstand that stress that still exists across supply chains. I would say though that if you take COVID within healthcare as an example, if you design the demand increases that we're seeing, there is a trade-off there, because if you design a supply chain to handle that level of increase, the redundancy you create will essentially mean that supply chain under business as usual circumstances is almost inoperable. So you have to take this in the round when looking at some of those future solutions. But for sure, the biggest vulnerability I would highlight is that pursuit of lean, and the biggest change I think we've seen in supply chain management is the willingness and interest in agile and flexible principles.
Yeah. Catherine, how can organisational culture impact the steady supply of essential healthcare products, do you think?
In my opinion, one of the biggest things to impact the steady supply of healthcare products is a culture of collaboration and adaptive culture. As Tom suggested, speaking to people, openly talking to people, identifying the requirements for need, looking at risk and contingencies. We experienced it with tracheostomy tubes, whereby there was a requirement for part of the manufacturing element. So the ink that was used in the manufacture of the tracheostomy tubes was also used in Defence Forces. I'm not exactly sure why, but they managed to secure all of that ink, which then gave us supply issues with the tracheostomy tubes, because the ink that was used had been verified as part of their accreditation process. So in order to change the ink, they needed to go back through the accreditation process again, which wasn't viable. Thankfully, we were safe, but there was some very sticky times throughout there. We did, using that as an example, discussed with the clinicians, reviewing alternatives, but unfortunately at the time, there really wasn't a lot of alternatives available, because the alternative suppliers didn't have enough raw materials themselves to up the manufacturing based on the demand surges. So it is really quite all a big circle, really. It all revolves around each other. One element feeds into the other. I'm sure that Tom saw a lot of evidence of that as well. So it's not something that we're all ready for, but it has highlighted some gaps where we can all improve, I believe, going forward.
Yeah. Tom, did you see evidence of that?
I think culture's an incredibly important part of resilience, or operationally, organisationally, and in supply chains. But I think, culture's an interesting one, isn't it? It means different things to different people. One of the kind of definitions of organisational culture that I quite like is it's what goes on around here. And in those kind of casual conversations between colleagues, what's important, what drives the behaviour, what drives the prioritisation. So I think from a kind of an organisational culture perspective, making resilience important is absolutely key, and I think that can happen in a number of ways. I think capability is an important aspect of that, and training and development. Catherine's point on collaboration, for sure. I think there are if you take some culture models which put collaboration and competition at opposite ends of a spectrum, for sure, as a health system, we should be collaborating on supply chain issues and supply disruption issues. And one of the things that I've experienced in my tenure as head of supply chain resilience is that system collaboration has improved markedly over the past 12 months plus, and the support that we get as NHS supply chain from our colleagues in trusts, in ICSs, in hospitals, is superb. And I think we genuinely are in a space now when there's an issue, we consider it our issue, and we collaborate, and in a culture of trust, to deliver the best possible solution as quickly as possible for ultimately our patients, and to continue that continuity of care as uninterrupted or unimpacted as possible. So yeah, it's a huge part of it, both organisationally and system wide. So I think it's a really good call out and a really good question.
Tracy, of course, you're got a lot of experience on the front line and nursing, and the bottom line is patients, isn't it? And patient safety. And I'm just wondering how patient safety and clinical intelligence is used in that resilience space.
So I think just to sort of first of all point out, and just building on this concept of culture as well, because they are not single entities, they're all part and parcel of a much bigger piece, or a matrix way of working. And that everyone on this call, at some point, we will all access care. We will all need care. And there's an assumption that those products will be there and will be able to be used to provide that care for us. So in terms of a culture and everyone buying into resilience as it being important to them, it's actually, to Tom's point, we're moving away from something that resilience being something that we do to something that we inherently are as part of the DNA and the way we work, and we do that across the whole system. From a patient safety perspective in clinical intelligence, there's two ends of the spectrum, and fundamentally, Tom's already talked about this. If we don't have product disruption and availability, the impact of it is multifaceted, from changing from one little cannula to a different one that looks different, it feels different, and actually for someone that's used to using the first one, if you give them a second one to do it, that might be much more difficult, and it might mean you don't cannulate as well as you would normally do that. Through to you don't have a piece of equipment that is used in a specific pump that is then used to deliver intravenous medication, which then means we have to source other hardware, and you have a delay in delivering medication, through to we can't actually provide life-preserving surgery because we don't have. So the impact on patients can be huge, and multifaceted. In terms of clinical intelligence, what the clinical intelligence does and provides is that so what? So when we have a supply disruption, the tack that I will take, and also my other clinical colleagues within supply chain, and also throughout the clinical networks in the UK, is the so what? So your supplier A, you're telling us you haven't got this product. So what are we supposed to do with that information? And how are we expected to still deliver care to our patients safely and provide quality care? And that intelligence brings it to life. And actually, from that bringing it to life, it then makes it more real, and it makes people feel the impact, because fundamentally, going back to my initial point, we're all potentially impacted. Because if we go into hospital and you haven't got product, the impact on you as a person individually, you don't want to feel that. So it's going back to Catherine's point, is actually it's really about that culture and everyone taking responsibility for their bit to make sure that continually we have product, high quality, that can be used and ensures continuity of patient care.
Catherine, do you want to add to that?
I agree with everything that Tom and Tracy were saying. Added to that, the due diligence aspect of all the different products that we require to ensure that they're safe for patient care, whether it's a patient that we've never met before, or whether it's myself or my mother. Everybody, in my perspective, everyone gets treated exactly the same, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. And so by, I guess, reviewing and looking at things from a bigger picture, so not just looking at it from a trust perspective, but also understanding that we need to collaborate with the wider team, so with NHS England, with NHS Supply Chain, with the various suppliers, with our other colleagues at different trusts, to share product if we need to. That's something that I think hasn't been very prevalent in the past, but going forward is such an invaluable tool that we've all learnt from, and that I believe that, in my opinion, that there's a lot more of that coming through now. So if we tell NHS Supply Chain, for example, that we've got supply issues with a particular product and we need it for XYZ specific reasons, then they can help us to source something that is appropriate, or provide the information so that we can do the due diligence checks, have the internal discussions, get that assurance from our clinical teams that the product is suitable for the requirements that we need it for. It's quite often assumed that one trust can use the same things as a different trust. Unfortunately, in many instances, that's not the case. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, and we just need to, again, talk, communicate, and find out what those differences are and what the actual reasons are behind it, not just because it's a pretty color or I like how it feels. It's the outcome that matters. And like I say, the due diligence aspects behind it. So the testing, the ingredients in it, making sure that it hasn't got any allergens or anything that's going to cause issues, or if it does, just so that we know that, so that we're aware of it. So there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people don't see.
I'm sure there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. A lot. It always amazes me on these conferences how much goes on behind the scenes with whatever topic within the NHS we're discussing. But I'm also wondering, Catherine, are there strategies in place as well to try and reduce dependence on single source suppliers as well? And then that will lead me nicely into a few questions that are popping up on the right-hand side of my screen.
That's definitely a topic that is very often discussed at my trust, and I'm sure many trusts and organisations in particular. As Tom was saying, it's ideal if we can have a more lean sourcing system, but equally that then provides risks and issues on its own. So if we are able to have those collaborative discussions to identify alternative products that are suitable for use, and have the required outcomes that we want, obviously that's the outcome that we're all going to want in the end. But it's not a straightforward solution, and it's not something that can be, I guess, implemented across the board for every single device, because there are many devices out there for which they're so specialist that it's very, very difficult to find the alternatives for. Or, as Tracy said, things may be equipment specific. So they are manufactured for that specific equipment, and they've had their calibration testing for that specific equipment. So if we put it in a different piece of hardware, we may end up with inaccuracies that we can't accept, that are unsafe for patient care. So yeah, it's not an easy, straightforward answer. I'm
Not
sorry.
easy, is it? I'm just going to take a few questions from the floor, and I hope I'll direct them to the right person. Maybe starting with you, Tom, for Nathan's point. Nathan says the NHS SC framework agreements seem to get extended without the possibility to add new suppliers. This effectively excludes new suppliers from a large part of the market. Is there going to be a process to add new suppliers mid-framework in the future? New suppliers can be effectively locked out of NHS purchasing for years. Just your thought on Nathan's point there, Tom. Or whether it's anything you can deal with separately.
I wouldn't say that's. I'm probably not the best person in NHS supply chain to answer a commercial question on framework nuance, but what I would say is if you have to abide by the terms of the framework agreement. In many cases, it is not technically possible to add new suppliers mid-framework. That is considered unfair to the incumbent suppliers on that framework. So at point of extension, every framework that is extended goes through a rigorous governance process to look at, is that still the appropriate solution for the market. So that's an in-depth process within NHS supply chain, and every case is considered on its merit and on balance. So we don't, under the terms of most framework agreements, we will not add new suppliers mid-framework. Extensions are considered in the round. That's kind of the best answer I can give to that.
Fair enough. I've probably got another tricky one for you, Tracy, and I think it's a you or a Tom answer, really. But Andrew says that the NHS supply chain runs a number of frameworks. I've been researching the framework for single-use PPE. From a resilience point of view, I don't understand why it's not dynamic and is fixed with no mechanism for new suppliers to join, similar to our last point. I've spoken to several companies on the framework and was surprised to find that they're no longer trading. This doesn't look resilient to me. Do you agree? I know these are tricky because they're very specific ones, but can you try and tackle that, Tracy, for Andrew, because clearly he's having a bit of a frustration there.
I think I'll probably take that one, Tracy. Could you just repeat the question?
So Andrew says the NHS supply chain runs a number of frameworks. I've been researching the framework for single-use PPE. From a resilience point of view, I don't understand why it's not dynamic and is fixed with no mechanism for new suppliers to join. I've spoken to several companies on the framework and was surprised to find that they're no longer trading. This doesn't look resilient to me.
I think the implication that dynamic purchasing systems are more resilient than framework agreements, I think you have to consider each in specific, according to the specifics and nuance of the market and category you're operating within. The single-use PPE framework will have been has been through our category management governance processes, and the outcome has been deemed acceptable. I can't comment on the specific parameters of that or aspects of that. I don't have it in front of me, so it wouldn't be appropriate to do so. It's quite difficult to answer a question that specific in this form.
Okay, Tracy, how best can you prepare? Can you prepare for supply chain disruption?
So there is, I think, there's two elements to that. There is the learning from previous disruptions, and we've talked a lot about a lot of our disruptions that we've had recently. There's a lot of it has been linked to single source, market share dominance. So we certainly are learning from what's happened in the past. moving forward again, going back to Catherine's point around collaboration, around getting intelligence sooner rather than later, and that involvement in working closely with our suppliers. So as Tom has already alluded to, that culture of trust and transparency, because we're all here, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to support safe patient care. That's what we're here for. And we all have a role to play. So I think we have certainly learned the lessons of the past. We're in a very new ecosystem now. Disruptions are part of the norm. And every time we get a new disruption, we seem to be one more step ahead than what we were before. And that will continue. And I think it goes a lot to what Catherine was talking about culture, in that we're not little islands, we're actually all in this together. And the more we're doing that, the more we're planning and being more prepared for when disruptions do happen, to make sure that that impact is not severe and it does not impact on continuity of care at the frontline.
Tom, I'm just wondering, how do you see the landscape for supply chains broadly, and do you think the current levels of disruption will continue, or are we going to see improved levels of disruption there?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think it probably it almost crosses with the previous question, which is disruption's extremely likely. I think that's fair to say. And I think given the geopolitical headwinds that we're currently experiencing, given the economic headwinds that we're facing, given the legacy disruption in supply chains still from COVID, from the Ukraine conflict, I don't see it going away. I think the next big event will happen. I can't predict when it will happen. I don't see stabilisation to 2018 levels for the next 5 years. Personally, I couldn't see that happening. I think supply chains take a long time to recover from significant events. So I think as a healthcare system, we need to be as prepared as possible for supply disruptions and bring resilience by design into the way we approach things as much as we can. I might just answer the previous question as well, which kind of dovetails quite nicely into the overall landscape. Can you prepare for supply chain disruption? I think my response to that would be you must prepare for supply chain disruption, because it will happen. And I think there are various ways of doing that. The first and most kind of important would be to take your organisation away from a purely reactive footing, which is kind of something's happened, how do we deal with it, to having a plan. So, how will you react to a disruption? What are the steps you will take to minimise the impact of that disruption on your organisation? That's a really important kind of first step. And then I suppose the follow on from that is, how do you become more proactive in that space? So how are you planning your supply chains, designing your supply chains to make sure that they are robust and appropriately robust? What visibility do you have upstream, and how are you predicting events that happen upstream and understanding the impact on your operations? Do you understand the impact of disruption in advance? So what I mean by that is, where are your most critical products? Can you live without X, Y, Z? And are ABC far more important to the continuity of the operation? These are questions that we should all be asking, within our respective organisations, and certainly questions I'm asking within NHS supply chain. So yeah, for sure, you can prepare and you must.
You must, exactly. Just one final thought I was just going to ask Catherine. I mean, Catherine, you spent 3 decades in the NHS, worked as a senior theatre nurse. I know Tracy's background, very much strong background in nursing too. How has being at the sharp end really benefited with your current role? I would imagine personally that you both bring a lot more to that table, having, you know, being on the front line yourself and seen what it's like and what you need.
Yeah, from my personal perspective, having had the clinical experience and I guess looking at the specific products, using them specifically provides much more of an in-depth knowledge when you're looking at it externally, sort of going shopping for the different products, for want of a better word, because you really do see the different levels and the different requirements. Examination gloves, for example, there's so many different testing specifications out there for examination gloves that until you, I guess, step out of the clinical world and step into the non-clinical world, yeah, it's just a huge eye-opener to see the different manufacturing strategies, all the different elements that go into it, that from a clinical perspective, you really don't understand. We can look at procedure packs and the processes that procedure packs go through in manufacture. Something as a clinician I had absolutely no idea of. But then stepping into this world, I was absolutely dumbfounded how much care and attention goes into every single element, or even the processing of, vacuum suction catheters. It's unbelievable. And you really don't credit it. But then you need to bring that experience back into the work that I'm doing today, and how can I help my colleagues to understand the issues that Tracy and Tom's teams are facing and the manufacturers, and why we can't get the products that you want, why we need to then look at alternatives, why single sourcing is not appropriate, why we need to collaborate, why we need to talk to each other and not just say, I want it because I need it. Okay, give me some specific reasoning and understanding behind that so that we can then talk to the manufacturers to see if they have an alternative product that can perhaps not do exactly the same thing, but will have a very, very close outcome. And, what steps do we need to take in order to achieve that?
Much as I would love to now go back to Tracy, I will get into a lot of trouble, Tracy, if I come back to you now, because the clock's beaten me. But I hope you'll join us again for a future panel. It's such an important subject, and it's been fascinating for me to hear the learnings and what's going on in your areas of specialty. So thank you very much. Another great conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Tom, to Tracy and Catherine, for giving some really valuable insight. And thank you to those of you who submitted questions. It's time now for our keynote with our partner, Procept Biorobotics Corporation. And joining us is their Director of Marketing and Commercial Development, Mark Buckley. Mark will be discussing the NICE approved technology for benign prostatic hyperplasia, which provides improved symptom relief and long-term quality of life through new robotic technology, which standardizes procedure time. I'm looking forward to hearing how this company can provide great operations solutions throughout the NHS on what is also a very important topic. So Mark, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I'm currently at an exhibition in Germany, so apologies if there's a little bit of background noise. So as I was very nicely introduced there, my name is Mark Buckley, the Commercial Marketing Director for Aquablation Therapy, which is a robotic solution for a very, very large disease state within the UK known as prostate hyperplasia, and a state that's been highly affected and continues to be affected with the elective procedure backlog. It affects around 50% of men over the age of 50 will have this disease state. And I'd like to talk to you about this new technology that's just received, as of last week, NICE approval, and is also now available on the NHS robotic supply chain. So next slide, please. So as I just said, aquablation robotic therapy, which is a robotic treatment for benign prostate hyperplasia, just received, as of last week, the highest level of recommendation from NICE. This is the NICE IPG, the Interventional Procedure Guidance, where they look at the effectiveness or robust safety and the outcomes of technologies coming to market, and whether they have a place within the world of the NHS and a place within the world of healthcare. Next slide, please. And on that basis, aquablation received the highest form of recommendation, which is known as standard arrangement, which is unique for this technology. It's being a robotic technology, obviously it has its benefits, but actually it's the only technology within this field that can treat any size of prostate. So any man walking through the door, whether they have complex anatomy, whether they have comorbidities, whether they have larger prostate anatomy, this technology can treat any size of prostate. And that was noted by the committee in their guidelines. They also noted that the technique and the procedure had a reduced form of bleeding And that reduced form of bleeding actually now allows this treatment phase to be done as a day case, reducing a large number of bed stays, which I'll talk about later on. But then more importantly, from the quality of life of a man, the committee noted that this technology not only treats the symptoms and has robust data over 5 years, but causes less sexual dysfunction. So one of the biggest impacts to men having a surgical treatment, especially around the prostate, is that yes, you may create a cavity and you may treat that prostate and you may treat those symptoms, but you actually impact other quality of life aspects for those patients further on down the road by damaging ducts, damaging nerve endings, and things of that nature. With the robotic, precise nature of aquablation, the committee noted that this causes less sexual dysfunction, so less quality of life impact to men over the long term compared to other treatments. Next slide, please. This technology is also the only technology the only robotic technology to have gone through a nice medtech innovation briefing. So this innovation briefing was done at the start of the year, not looking so much at the safety and robustness of the procedure, but more on the economic and whole healthcare impact to the whole healthcare environment. So next slide, please. So within the NICE MedTech Innovation Briefing, this briefing was published earlier this year, and this shows that, again, the same committee that went to surgical consultants, it went to patient consultants, and it did a review of the actual landscape of this disease state and how this technology fits within it. The experts advised within this review that it's an innovative technology compared to this, again, offering additional benefits, but more importantly, allowing the patients to preserve their sexual function and the ability for a hospital to offer this as day case. So this, again, this review showcased that this technology not only is improving the symptom relief, but it's actually preserving the long-term quality of life and offering additional benefits to the NHS around day case elective procedure outcomes that can then be used to improve the efficiency of the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So as I said, this, and please play the animation on this slide. So this technology is the only technology that spans all sizes of prostate. Next slide, please. This technology not only prioritizes the symptom relief that patients need, they're going to have a symptom treated, they're going with benign prostate hyperplasia. Not only is it prioritizing that, but it's also, next slide please, going to be protecting the long-term quality of life that patients look for. Next slide, please. And patients really get bucketed into 4 different areas of size, and this technology spans all those areas. And how does it do it? So aquablation uses real-time image guidance. So it allows for the first time the urologist, the physician, to see the whole entire prostate under real-time image guidance, under ultrasound imaging. And then with that real-time image guidance, the urologist can create a personalized treatment plan for that patient. So specifically based on that anatomy, the urologist can map how the treatment should look, the areas they want to preserve and the areas they want to protect, and then map that to be executed by the robot itself. So the robot is a robotically assisted procedure. So it's assisting the surgeon in doing the procedure by either holding the tools or executing on certain parts of the procedure. And through doing that, it's doing it with sub-millimeter precision. So there's no variability in hand movement. There's no variability in skill set. There's no variability in dexterity. The robot is built to be highly dexterous, and it can then assist in executing a plan with sub-millimeter precision and removing the tissue that needs to be removed and preserving the tissue that needs to be preserved. This is also done without heat, which is unique to this technology because most other procedures use a heat-based form of resection, either TURP loops or laser fibers. This does the resection without heat, thus causing less damage, less impact to the patient's quality of life by not inflicting heat-based damage to other organs or other substrates around the prostate. Next slide, please. The technology, as it went through the IPG, is backed by multi-randomized controlled trials. So there's over 5 years worth of results on different sizes of prostates, on global multi-center trials, and also an all-comers open registry based in the UK. So this is how the technology received its IPG, its interventional procedure guidance last week, because it has a robust set of data, not only looking at the impact of the procedure, but also the impact to patients and the outcomes that it can then bring. Next slide, please. And really the benefit of this technology for the healthcare system is not only the fact that it gives these patients these long-term quality of life benefits, but actually to the surgical system, the ability for the robot to standardize the procedure. So what you can see here on the bar chart is a normal procedure called a TURP, which is an everyday procedure done in the urology department. You can see by the scatter graph, by the dots, a huge variability in the time taken, the resection time taken to treat prostates, no matter what the size. Not size dependent, there's a huge variability. Whereas on the blue graph, you can see aquablation treats the prostate in the same span of time. It's a very concentrated scattergraph because the time taken to treat the prostate is very, very specific. It's very, very standardized, and that allows for not only more patients to be treated on a theatre list, but actually more patients to be treated on the theatre list with different sizes of prostates, with different skill sets of surgeons. So you can actually then really enhance and improve the standardization of that theatre list and actually execute on more patients in one theatre list than you can do with standard technology. Next slide, please. And as we've shown in our study, it's not dependent on patient experience, on surgeon experience, sorry. So what this has done in the UK, we did this in Guy's, as you can see here. A news story was made out of this by the Daily Mail. The surgical team in Guy's used that standardized robotic approach that I just talked to you about to almost triple the number of patients they could treat in one list. So Guy's and St. Thomas, unfortunately, is a very large BPH reference center, a very large urology department, very large robotic center, but they have a very large waiting list, and they can't get all of their surgeons treating all their patients all of the time. So they managed to put on what they call an aquablation hit list, where they tripled the number of patients, they tripled the number of BPH patients they could treat in one day without having to constrict size and without having to worry about surgeon experience. So we're already seeing in the UK now this robotic technology allowing hospitals to really maximize their output. And in the case of Guy's, actually, they've depleted their waiting list by around 40% through implementing this technology and really maximizing that ability to treat a number of patients in one day on one theatre list, where it usually would be 3. In this case, they did 10. Next slide, please. And because it's robotically executed, because it's standardized the procedure, it also doesn't have a very long learning curve. So again, this is Norfolk and Norwich's data, another NHS hospital. You can see in the first instance, there's a slight wide variability in the scattergraph on the first 3 patients, but then it very quickly concentrates and the time comes down very, very rapidly over 10 patients as the learning curve is very, very greatly brought down. So not only are you allowed to maximize it, you can bring patients up to speed and get them to be treating patients quicker when using this technology with that standardization approach. And now in the case of Guy's and St. Thomas, they're now bringing on 5, 6, 7 different surgeons onto the technology and allowing them to all maximize the opportunity to treat more patients and get through the elective backlog. Next slide, please. And just press this forward to bring up the table. So the same-day discharge of aquablation, because of the reduced bleeding rates and because of the great outcomes, centers in the US, primarily driven by COVID, started to explore whether aquablation could be done as a day case elective procedure. Typically, prostates of these sizes, typically these patients stay in for 1 or 2 nights, but because the outcomes with aquablation as shown in the data is so strong, clinicians started to look at whether same-day discharge was a possibility. And in this small feasibility study done in the US, they actually had an 87% success rate of patients going home the same day, treated in the morning or just after lunch, and then going home by 5 o'clock and then coming back the next day for catheter removal or doing at-home catheter removal and not having to come back into hospital at all, which is a complete change and shift in paradigm of patients having to stay in for 1 or 2 nights, having to be monitored, having to be observed, and then having to go through a trial by catheter removal. If you can do it all within 1 day and do the trial by catheter removal at home, then it completely changes the need for the patient to come in and frees up the staff just beyond the elective list on the theatre. Next slide, please. And again, please. So this then, taking that experience in the US, this feasibility was then done in the UK in Frimley Park. Initially, 10 patients were done as a feasibility study to see if they can get patients home the same day and they can also maintain the safety and the outcomes of those patients. And in this small subset of 10 patients in this feasibility study, they did 10 patients successfully as day case, 0 readmissions and 0 needs for patients to have any in-home intervention. So again, Frimley, off the back of the confidence they had from the US, proved that they could do it locally within an NHS setting, within a patient setting. Next slide, please. We'll then show how that program has then developed to now be a standard program within Frimley Park that around 50% of all patients treated with aquablation going home the same day. So we're now seeing it as becoming a standard approach to allow not only high numbers of patients treated on one elective list, almost triple the numbers as normal, but also 50% of those patients theoretically being able to be sent home the same day. So completely changing the number of patients that can be treated and the burden that those patients provide to the hospital in terms of beds and monitoring to also be completely changed and allow those patients to go home and have a much more nicer setting for themselves. Next slide, please. Thank you for having the option to present aquablation, this new robotic technology, which is now available on NHS supply chain and has been recommended by NICE on the IPG. And hopefully you'll hear more about this in your hospitals. So we have a lot of surgeons, a lot of urologists across the NHS interested in this technology as a way of helping them not only treat the elective backlog, but also change the workflow and change the outcomes within those urology practices, allowing them to treat more patients with less staff and get patients home quicker. So hopefully you'll see this technology now being implemented in more NHS sites around the UK.
So thanks, Mark, for sharing what Procept Robotics is doing for the healthcare system. If you've got any questions you'd like to ask Mark, then please send them to events@cognitivepublishing.com and the team will forward them on. Time for another short break before our next panel. Please make networking to connect with your peers from across the NHS and share your thoughts and ideas on what you think could be improved right across the network. I'll see you back in 10 minutes' time.